outset that while I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history from Thomas Jefferson's College of William and Mary, I am no expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, given recent events of the past few years in the Middle East, I have become more interested in what's happening there and what happened there. And this exploration is my attempt to make some sense of the situation, grounded in our unique principles. I apologize in advance for errors and omissions because I'm well aware that historical interpretations depend on the sources chosen and the reliability of those sources, and I'm happy to be corrected and directed to other sources of information. Now, according to Rabbi David Zaslav, in his book, Jesus, the First Century Rabbi, much of Jewish history revolves around the ideas of exile, redemption, and revelation. He also mentions an inside joke that Jewish holidays revolve around the concept of they tried to kill us, we prayed, we fought, we won. Let's eat! Zaslav also notes that many Jews find the terms Old Testament and New Testament to be pejorative because it suggests that the new replaces the old. Rabbi Zaslav prefers the terms Elder Testament and Younger Testament, and that's the language I'll use today. Now, in the Elder Testament, there are stories of the Jewish people being overrun militarily by the Babylonians and forced to live in exile, away from their homeland. The song we just heard, by the waters of Babylon, is based on Psalm 137 and reflects the pain of exile and the sadness that people feel about being apart from Zion, that is, Jerusalem. What the song doesn't reflect is the anger which with the psalm ends. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Revenge is undoubtedly a strong human instinct and continues to play a role in the region, in the world, and in our own minds and hearts. Resisting the urge to seek revenge and instead seek peace and reconciliation may be one of the most difficult challenges we face as human beings. After centuries of the Jewish diaspora, that is, Jewish people living scattered throughout the world, during the late 19th and 20th centuries, some Jewish leaders who came to be known as Zionists began to advocate for a separate Jewish homeland. In the early 1900s, some influential people in the United Kingdom supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in Africa, called the Uganda Program, in what is now modern-day Kenya. Had that happened, perhaps our president would be accused of being Jewish. You got that. But the focus of most Zionists was on the creation of a homeland in a geographical area called Palestine, the location of the ancestral Jewish homeland, about the size of New Jersey. Today, this area consists of modern-day Israel, probably best shown in the third panel there on the map. Of course, then there's also the West Bank. That's the land on the west bank of the Jordan River Valley, known to Israelis as Judea and Samaria, so that green blob there. And then the Gaza Strip, a small piece of land in green across the way, which the Gaza Strip is about the size and density of Philadelphia. The distance across from the Jordan River, across through Jerusalem to the Mediterranean Sea, is only 44 miles. It's less than the distance from here to Shortfall. Give you a sense of the scale. Now, during World War I, the Allies, that's Britain, France, and Russia, were essentially at a stalemate with the Central Powers. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And the British became convinced that supporting Zionism would help their war aims by bringing money and media attention to the war, and perhaps even bringing America into the fight. Eventually, to that end, was a letter that was dated November 2nd, 1917, and was sent from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. This letter came to be known as the Balfour Declaration, and it said the following, quote, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It continued, It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights or political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So they were very careful to support a homeland, not necessarily a state, and he made a point of recognizing the rights of the indigenous people. He also didn't want other countries to start expelling their Jews from their countries and forcing them to come to Palestine. Now, when the Allies won World War I, the lands of the Ottoman Empire were divided up, and the British obtained the League of Nations, precursor to the United Nations, a mandate for Palestine to administer until, at some point, the land might be able to rule itself. Jewish immigration to Palestine, which had already begun in earlier decades, intensified. Interestingly, Balfour himself appears to have supported a Jewish homeland in part because he doubted Jews could be assimilated in British culture. And, as odd as it may sound, Zionists in Germany and the Nazis worked together to support Jewish immigration of some 60,000 German Jews from Germany to Palestine. It's from the period about 1933 to 1940, 1941. Of course, the Zionists wanted to be able to get to Palestine, and the Nazis saw this as one way to rid themselves of their Jewish problem. Now, after some violence between the Jewish settlers and the Palestinians in the 1930s, followed by World War II and the Holocaust, sympathy for the Zionist cause increased, and the success of the movement culminated on November 29, 1947, when the newly created United Nations General Assembly passed a non-binding resolution recommending the partition of Palestine into 3 Jewish sections and 4 Arab sections, leaving Jerusalem as an internationally administered city. That second panel there shows the UN plan. Now, the 6 Arab nations in the General Assembly walked out in protest. The New York Times reported the following. Quote, the walkout of the Arab delegates was taken as a clear indication that the Palestinian Arabs would have nothing to do with the Assembly's decision. The British have emphasized repeatedly that British troops could not be used to impose a settlement that was not acceptable to both Jews and Arabs, and the partition plan does not provide outside military force to keep order. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. So while this expression of support for a Holy Land homecoming was a joyous occasion for many Jewish people who supported the plan, it was not quite so joyous for the Arabs who did not. This is why, as Dylan said, Israel is always on trial for just being born. Now, one could argue that such a resolution really flies in the face of what we say are our duty values. Does the recommendation to take land from one group of people and give it to another demonstrate the inherent worth and dignity of those people who had their land taken? Does it reflect justice, equity, and compassion toward those whose land is taken from them? And while a democratic process was used, is that the appropriate mechanism to determine that land be taken from one group of people and be given to another? Did this plan lead to peace, liberty, and justice for all? I think the history and the present situation indicate the answer to all these questions is no. So on May 14th, 1948, 6 months after that UN partition resolution, which again was a non-binding recommendation, and whose implementation hinged on acceptance by both Arabs and Jews, the Arabs rejected it, Jewish leaders announced the creation of the State of Israel. British troops left, many Palestinians fled, and Arab armies invaded Israel and started the first Arab-Israeli war. A war in which Israel was victorious. Now, continued in the years that followed, and there was a 6-day war in 1967 that resulted in Israel taking over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, shown in that third panel. It should be noted, though, that in 2005, Israel pulled out from the Gaza Strip completely. The military came home, and some 1,700 families were forcibly removed and brought back inside Israel's borders. Now, maps like these may seem innocuous, but they are political documents and can show bias. And some might object to this representation of the loss of Palestinian land. The second map is on your order of service, and what I'll show here reflects a dispute. I apologize for the word lies being scrawled across it. I couldn't find when it's a difference of opinion. Now, some would say in response to this map that, for example, the land in green in the first panel showing Palestinian land. They're saying that land wasn't privately owned by Arabs. Only a tiny percentage of land in Palestine was privately owned by anyone. And most of the land was held by the government. So to show that whole area as if Palestinian Arabs were already living there is not really correct. I don't have time to go through the rest of the disputes, but you can perhaps research it on your own time. The bottom line, though, is after over 66 years, it's clear that the creation of the State of Israel has caused such damage in the Middle East that peace in the region is unlikely anytime soon. The enmity between displaced Palestinians and their descendants and the Israelis who feel insecure and besieged remains strong. Both sides have been responsible for horrible acts of violence. Many Arabs and those who sympathize with the Palestinians, such as many people in Iran, refuse to recognize the State of Israel and continue to call for its destruction. It's no wonder that the Israelis are afraid that a nation like Iran could possess a nuclear weapon. And the United States continues to support Israel financially and militarily to the tune of about $2 to $4 billion a year in direct aid since 2001. Even though Israel continues to build settlements on the West Bank over our public objections and those of the Palestinians. Israel is slowly running out the clock, to use Dylan's words. So since Israel is here to stay, the main goal would seem to be the need to have safety and security and civil rights for everyone in the region. But the current lack of freedom in the West Bank is palpable. The decrees of the military, regional commanders are law. Palestinians have movement limitations due to the Israeli system of permits and checkpoints, which fragment the territory into these unconnected ethnic enclaves. Palestinians can be held administratively without charge for indefinite periods. In 1987, the Commission found that Israel's General Security Service had used various forms of torture since the earliest days of the occupation, though in 1999 the Israeli Supreme Court ended that practice. Moreover, concrete walls have been built with the aim of severing the West Bank from the remaining territory. How ironic is it that Jewish people who in the past were themselves segregated into ghettos seem to be doing the same thing to another group of people? Now, some equate these segregated enclaves to those that existed in apartheid South Africa, including somebody with experience in negotiating peace in that region, former President Jimmy Carter. Perhaps Israel has become somewhat of a neighborhood bully after all. Now, many Israelis and Palestinians say they want a two-state solution, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. There always seem to be roadblocks in negotiations. Palestinian Arabs have refused time and time again to any solution that recognizes the state of Israel. Even if they wish to do so now, it may be too late, as that fourth map suggests. In the meantime, Israel continues to expand its settlements in the West Bank. As recently as August of this year, the Israelis declared 990 acres as Israeli state land near a settlement west of Bethlehem. A group called Americans for Peace Now used to this declaration as proof that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is thwarting the two-state vision and really wants a one-state solution, one in which Israel ultimately annexes the West Bank into the state of Israel. Now, the one-state solution is not a new one. In the 1920s, left-wing intellectuals such as Jewish religious philosopher and poet Martin Buber, who later opposed that partition plan, advocated for, quote, a binational state in which two peoples will enjoy totally equal rights as befits the two elements shaping the country's destiny, irrespective of which of the two is numerically superior at any given time. Unquote. And some Palestinians and Israelis exhausted by the lack of progress are taking this position today. Now, the United States might officially object to such a one-state solution. The problem is that Euro-Americans have little moral ground on which to stand. The Israelis, after all, are only doing the same things that Europeans did in North America. Many Euro-Americans espouse the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States of America should extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea, and that God gave them the right to do so, if not a duty. Our named clergy person, Reverend Mitchell, often reminds us that when we sing that song, "We'll build a land," not to forget whose land was confiscated to build our land. And in the same way, many of the Jews believe that God, as described in the Old Testament, gave them to the right to land that they inhabit and occupy. Eretz Israel, they call it, or Greater Israel. Over 500,000 Israelis now live in the West Bank. Israel is on its way to fulfilling its own manifest destiny. And it appears we, Americans and the international community, are not really willing to do anything significant to stop it. And perhaps more importantly, Israelis would argue that the mountains along the Jordan River are necessary to ensure Israel's security. It's likely they will never let go of that. Now, as for the Gaza Strip and its 1.6 million inhabitants, Israelis supporting a one-state solution don't appear to be interested in annexing the Gaza Strip. Some hope it will be absorbed into Egypt, or at least just remain a hostile area isolated from Israel by existing separation barriers. So what are we to do as Jews? How do our values guide us? If Israel is bound and determined to retain control of the West Bank, what should be our response? Do we accept Israeli attempts to continue to isolate Palestinians on something like reservations, as we did to our native people, or as Afrikaners did to theirs in South Africa? Or do we, as was done during the South African apartheid period, demand civil and human rights for all in accordance with our values? Might a one-state solution be acceptable if the Palestinians were granted citizenship and full civil rights in a greater Israel? Now, to form a greater Israel, both sides would have to give. Palestinians would probably have to concede that there's no more right of return to those previously held lands. But with political representation, Palestinians in a greater Israel could advocate for better schools, more investment, greater opportunities in the areas in which they live. Israelis would have to accept that Palestinians have rights, and right to political power and to equal rights. Now, to those Israelis who would fear the political power of this new Jewish Palestinian citizens of Israel, proponents of a one-state solution suggest that a greater Israel would remain democratic, Jewish, by encouraging mass migration of Jews from around the world. The overall hope is that with enlightened leadership and a spirit of mutual understanding and respect, over time, maybe a very long period of time, Israelis and Palestinians will become better people in a greater Israel. Just as, over time, America has grown more democratic and accepting of multicultural identities. And who knows? One day Israel might even have a Palestinian prime minister. Now, within our own UU movement, there is a group called the UUs for Justice in the Middle East. And I invite you to check out its website, explore what they have to say about this issue, Do your own research, listen to multiple points of view, as I try to do with this exploration, and come to your own conclusions. The status quo seems to me clearly unacceptable. Perhaps there's still some hope for a two-state solution that can be negotiated, but it seems to me that at some point Israelis and Palestinians will have to recognize that the current state of affairs is a greater Israel, but it should be one in which every person has civil rights, which is an expression of their inherent worth and dignity of each person, in a country that celebrates the democratic process. One nation with liberty and justice for all. Perhaps one day this Holy Land homecoming for the Jewish people will actually fulfill the dream of we'll build a land where justice will flow down like water and peace like an ever-flowing stream for everyone. Blessed be.
Amen.